This is a general series on how to get the most out of university, the art of learning in an institution of higher education. And I try to give you a kind of personal take on it, my sort of take on how to do it. And one of the things I really emphasize is that becoming good at something requires you, or allows you is probably a better way to put it, allows you to enjoy it. So you're always looking for the pleasure in these things. And today we're going to talk about reading. So I hope that one of the things you'll look for as I talk about reading is, how is this going to help me enjoy it more? Part of it, of course, is going to be how is it going to help me get more out of reading, learn more, be better prepared for my exams, be better able to write my papers and so forth on the basis of my reading. How is it going to help me do that? But hopefully you'll also be thinking, how is this going to make it more fun, more exciting, more interesting, more satisfying to my curiosity? Walt Whitman, the American poet, used to say, whatever satisfies the soul is truth. And that's one thing we're going to try to look for in our reading, is something that satisfies us intellectually. Good. I hope that's still the event you're looking for. I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then there's plenty of time for questions. Only the prepared 45 minutes to an hour will be recorded. So when we get to the questions, we'll turn off the recording, and then you can just talk freely. You're also welcome to interrupt me along the way if you want. I won't turn the camera on you or anything like that. Usually I'll have to repeat the question or something like that to make it work. Come on in. And like I say, other than linking you to the resources at the blog, where I talk a lot more about many of these things, I don't use slides of any kind, no tricks, but I do draw some pictures. And I'm going to draw a picture that's reminiscent of the one from last week, that just to kind of get us started. And this is, of course, the also kind of the logo for our series. This is kind of what we are using as a guiding metaphor throughout. It's, of course, an iceberg. And the reason that we refer to an iceberg when we talk about learning is actually inspired by Ernest Hemingway. When he talked about writing, the dignity of the movement of an iceberg lies in only 1/8 of it being above water. So the dignity of the knowledge that you acquire at university is going to be related to everything that's under the surface. What's above the surface is your ability to make up your mind about complicated, interesting things. That could be finance, could be marketing, could be organization, whatever courses you're in. So it makes you, the knowledge you acquire here will make you better able to think, right? And that's part of your performance, right? So your ability, you will kind of become aware of this. Before you got your education, you were so able to make sense of things that were going on in the world, right? As you got more educated about finance, marketing, organization, whatever it is you're taking, when things happen in the world that are relevant or related to that, you're better able to understand it. You're better able to form a belief about it, right? So you're better able to think. You're also becoming a better conversationalist about the subjects that you're studying. You're becoming a better talker, right? You're just simply becoming more conversant in the subject matter. So you started out kind of not really knowing what to say about certain things, and then you learned more about it, and then you became better able to say certain things about it. You became better able to participate in a conversation, especially with other knowledgeable people. And of course, both of these things, both of these competences are going to be the subjects of specific talks in the series. So there is a talk called How to Think, and there is a talk called How to Talk, right? There's also one called How to Write, as you can imagine. And what's interesting about some of the talks is that they seem to address what's below the surface much more explicitly, because knowledgeable people perform as thinkers, talkers, and writers. That's one way we can see that they're knowledgeable. It's also one of the reasons we examine you for these abilities, right? So when you go to an exam, you're being examined in, can you think, talk, and write about these subjects, right? So we're asking you to perform your competence. But there are certain things that we don't really ask you to perform directly, but which are under the surface of that. And one of them is certainly reading. Right, and that's our topic for today, is how does our reading give us something under the surface to support our thinking, talking, and writing? And I mentioned this last week, and I'll mention these things recurrently. There's actually also, under the ability to talk, a very important ability that's sort of hiding underneath the surface there, kind of just under the waves, the ability to listen, right? So if you're a good talker, you're actually also probably, hopefully, a good listener, or being a good listener helps you to become a good talker, right? And there's the same thing is true of thinking. If you're good at thinking, it's actually because you also have a certain amount of emotional precision, right? So you've got, just under the surface of your thinking, there is a kind of ability to channel your passions, to marshal your emotions in a proper direction, right? To keep things kind of orderly, to stay calm even. So there is an emotional competence underneath your conceptual competence as well, if you will. So just keep that in mind, that we're looking at reading today as one of the things that's under the surface. We'll look at feeling and listening as well. There's no talk called How to Feel. I thought that would be a little bit too poetic, but there is a talk called How to Enjoy Things. Right, which is really where I'm trying to get at that idea of what does it feel like to know things? How can it feel good to be knowledgeable? Right, that's the competence we're going to be looking at there. Today we're talking about something pretty straightforward compared to all those other things. Certainly some of those other things. We're going to talk about something pretty straightforward, and it's obviously the thing that's also just below the surface of your writing ability. The better you can read, the better you will be able to write, not just because you'll have something to write about, but because if you're reading actively and reading in a curious and engaged way, then you're also learning how to write from your reading. You're sort of reverse engineering your reading process by writing, right? So you're really kind of trying to figure out, how does good writing work? Well, I figure that out by noticing how good writing works when I'm reading it. Good. So let's start with, again, probably a pretty prosaic question with what to read, right? What is it that we're reading? I like to say there's two things that we generally look at when we're reading. One of them is sort of what we can call documentation, and the other one is literature. And I'll try to distinguish between those two things. We can call one of them maybe media and the other one more like research or scholarship, kind of separate them like that, but it's not a very clean separation. Even documentation and literature is not a very clean separation, but I'll try to put it into a context for you in a moment. When I talk about documentation, what I mean is, let's say you want to say that the company that you're studying had a good third quarter, right? So they had a financially good third quarter. That's kind of a value judgment you're making there. You're certainly interpreting some facts. And what you want to do is base that on something. So you want to have done some reading that entitles you to say, Apple had a good third quarter in 2017, or whatever it is that you want to, whichever company or whichever quarter you're interested in, whatever parameter you're interested in. So it'll be things like company reports, like maybe their annual report will give you, if you've read their annual report, that gives you that information. But maybe you've read the financial press on that. So maybe you've read the Wall Street Journal, right? And a story has said this. And in general, although journalism can be challenged and sometimes it makes mistakes, in general, we take many of these sources, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Børsen here in Denmark, right? The business press, and even just the ordinary daily newspapers, we take them as pretty much sources of information. So we read them and they have a certain amount of authority. We know how to use them. Good example also is The Economist weekly magazine that we, of course, also have access to for you in the library, that you can actually read in paper as well in the library if you so choose. You can sit down and read that, and that's one of the things you might read. One of the sources of knowledge that you'll have is annual reports, and then you'll have media of various kinds. And, media, I'll put that in two different categories here. There'll be magazines and newspapers, right? And we sometimes find it a little bit hard to distinguish between these things today. I'll get into that also when we talk about the scientific literature, that sometimes we just get a news story and it's hard to tell, is it in a magazine? Is it in a newspaper? Is it on a news site that's really used to be a television channel, but now it's sort of this multimedia kind of thing. So sometimes it's just nice to figure out what kind of media organization is it I'm reading, right? Who is actually sending this? So keep track of that as some possibilities. And then there's another set of things that you might want to consider, which is just official statistics. So one of the things you might be reading and following, some of you might be often going in and checking Bloomberg's, like just Dow Jones. You might have various personal reasons for that. You might also have educational, professional reasons for that. But there's certainly other sources of information that come at you on a running basis, and you just keep track of those as well. Let's consider all that part of your reading that documents facts that are going on in the world, right? But beyond that, there is another set of reading, which is the literature that you read. Much of this is reading that you will be assigned in your classes, but it's not the only thing that you will be. You'll not only be reading the things you're assigned, you'll sometimes have to find things to read as well. So these are things like your textbooks. I should have brought a textbook. I didn't actually bring a textbook. But I think you all have textbooks of various kinds, compendia of various kinds, but a textbook is a very interesting piece of reading because it is directed at people specifically in your situation. Students who are being introduced to various kinds of theories and concepts and facts of the matter. So you're being, they're books that are used as the basis of teaching. And it's important to keep in mind that there is an implicit asymmetry in any reading that we're doing when we're reading a textbook. You are being positioned as somebody who doesn't know, as a not knowledgeable person, as a student of the subject, right? And the author is positioning themselves as an authority on the subject, somebody who can tell you what is the case. So when you're reading, you're doing a particular kind of reading when you're reading a textbook. It's actually not the normal kind of reading that we do in academia. It's not in a certain sense, it's not academic, and it's not scholarly, because you're not being treated as an equal when you're reading a textbook. Of course, it's totally helpful, and it's very helpful to have somebody who says, I know what I'm talking about. You probably need help understanding this, so I will explain it to you, right? But it's a particular kind of reading that isn't going to be the same for all of the reading you do. And so we're going to be looking at that difference a little bit. Let's keep that in mind. There are your textbooks. There are then also journal articles. And I've brought a very, very classic example of this. So we have like the Academy of Management Journal. Lots of our researchers here publish in journals like this. Important thing to keep in mind is that it is actually a periodical. So it comes out regularly, collects a bunch of papers that don't necessarily have anything to do with each other thematically. They're just recently published research, right? Research that's been recently completed, has gone through a peer review process. And those peers have assured that the things in these journals are of interest to other researchers. So when you're reading journal articles, you're actually reading communication from one researcher or group of researchers to other researchers. And that's just an important difference to keep in mind between journals and textbooks. Sometimes, in fact, I would say probably quite often, you will be pointed directly to a journal article by your teachers. On Canvas, they might just link directly to it, and you'll just go straight to the database and download it. Or you might have a compendium, a paper printed compendium with various things in there. Some of them might be journal articles. And so it's important to keep in mind every once in a while just to take that journal article that you've been asked to read and situate it in the journal that you're reading it in. Just every once in a while, just say, I really wonder where this belongs, and then find the original issue of it. You can find it online as well. You don't have to find the paper version. Find the original issue of it. We'll certainly help you with that at the library. See what else was being published at that time. All right. Get kind of a sense of what was going on at the time and what sort of writing this really is, right? And what kind of context this belongs. It can be a useful thing to do. And then there's books, actual monographs that are written by your, this probably often many of the same people that write the journal articles. I have a few examples here with me, also because I wanted to show you important difference between the way these books are put together. So one would be a book like this, right? Sense Making in Organizations. It's a classic in the sense making and organization studies, in the sense making tradition, by Carl Weick. It's an entire book written by one person, right? Divided into chapters, dealing with different aspects of the subject of sense making in organizations, right? Very straightforward book. It's like a fully formed piece of writing. Then there's another, notice this one's called Sense Making in Organization, and it's by Carl Weick, and this one is called Making Sense of the Organization, and it's also by Carl Weick, and it's also a book. And so it seems very similar, but it's actually a very, very different kind of book. So you're welcome to look at these afterwards, right? This is a book, chapters, one person wrote the whole thing. This one's also a book, one person wrote all the parts to it, but it's actually a collection of papers that were originally published in journals. So it's one person's journal production gathered in a collection, in an anthology, right? That's an important distinction to make. The articles that are reprinted here were first printed somewhere else in another context. So they didn't make it into the world in this form, in a book form. They made it into the world in article form. Keep that in mind when you're reading. This text that I'm reading, how did it originally appear, right? And then similarly, sort of the step beyond that is a book like this, Contemporary Organization Theory, which is also an anthology. This time it is by a bunch of contributors who have contributed chapters to this book. And there is, of course, a chapter about, though not by, Carl Weick in this book. I think it's by Barbara Czarniawska in this book, which covers the same subject matter, but it's now written by somebody else, right? And it's in a collection with a whole bunch of other authors writing on a bunch of different subjects, a bunch of different topics. Different kind of book. And then keep in mind that when you're asked to read things in your courses, you will usually be pointed to just one item, one chapter, one text, one article. And it's kind of up to you. You'll probably be told a little bit about this as well, but it's kind of up to you to say, okay, what was this paper originally? What was this chapter originally? Where did it belong before it was taken out of its context, put in my compendium, and given to me like, this is just the plain truth, right? What's its original context? So please keep that in mind when you're thinking about books. And then I have two other examples of things in book form that you might want to read. This is a book called, I have to remember what it's called, Dynamic Capabilities in Strategic Management by David Tease. It's kind of like Sense Making in Organizations. It's a monograph. It's his statement at the time of writing. But the reason I like to emphasize it is that in the preface, he says the following. I'm just going to read this out loud for you because it really gives you a good sense of who am I as a reader, What do I bring to this book when I'm reading it? He says, it is hoped that this book will provide new insights to readers not familiar with the literature on dynamic capabilities. So he's identifying a group of readers. He's saying some people will not be familiar with this literature. Hopefully this book will be of use to them, right? That could be students trying to get into it. But then he says the following, to those already familiar with the literature, it is hoped that this book will help mold disparate ideas and observations together in such a way that it stimulates deeper insights into business and economic phenomena. Right? So there's a second group of readers that he's addressing there. He's saying there's some people need to be introduced to the subject. I've got them covered. I hope they get something out of this book. I've also had in mind, as I was reading this book or writing this book, I've also had in mind people who are already familiar with it. I'm trying to move the conversation forward. And so you might be sometimes looking at the book and saying, well, how is that conversation going? And then he says the last thing, he says, it is my sincerest wish that managers who read on will become more astute and reflective managers. So another group of readers that he's actually interested in getting into contact with, and that the book has also been written for. And that's one of the things you'll find with especially books, is that they address themselves to multiple audiences, right? They have ambitions with particular different audiences. And you'll notice that you, as a student at a university, are kind of moving towards, you're starting as somebody who's not familiar with the literature. And then you're going to, at some point, you can return to this book and you will read it as somebody who is familiar with the literature and who needs their thinking to be supported and made and brought and advanced by a book like this. And then, of course, you graduate, you get into business, you're a manager, right? Now you're still one of the readers that he was thinking of, but you've become a different reader again, right? And what changed? Well, you read more things, right? So you just became a different reader as you went along. So one of the important kind of points in the art of reading is to keep in mind that you are changing as a reader, and you should let the books you read and the text you read change you. Figure out how they're addressing you, right? And then allow yourself to be addressed in different ways as you go. And then the last book, this one I actually just found when I was visiting Dublin. I went into a bookstore and I saw this one. I thought this was for a librarian, a nice book. This is not the end of the book. It's actually 10 years old. And it's all about these new technologies, the internet, media, all this sort of thing, and all this continuous discussion about, will the book one day just become obsolete? And one of the points that Umberto Eco and Cahier make, it's an interesting book. It's just a dialogue between two quite smart people. One of the points they make is that the book has lasted a very, very long time. It's as a media format, right? As just a kind of a way of storing information. It's done way better than magnetic tape, compact discs, vinyl, right? It's just has a longer history, and it doesn't really seem to need any improvement. You just put words on paper and they last. That's interesting. It's a medium that works. You don't need any particular app or reader or device to use the book. You can just open it and it's right there, ready for use. So it's very handy. And so they make a really good comparison. They say books are, as a technology, the book is kind of like the spoon. It's like, try to come up with a better way to eat soup, right? It's, once that spoon was invented, they kind of nailed that. And so the book maybe has a similar kind of feeling to it. This sort of format is quite useful. Yes, sir?
I would like to reply to the previous statement you made that the books often have the different audience that they are talking about. So how would my reading change when I approach a book from the student perspective versus when I approach a book from the more like mentor perspective? So what should I look at?
Yeah, so there's a very, very important difference between both the manager and the researcher perspective. So as a student, you're sort of becoming a scholar, but then I guess you'll decide at some point whether or not you'll become a scholar or a manager, like where you're going to go after that. As a student, you're trying to learn what these theories even are, right? What does this even mean? You're trying to get a handle on the subject at a very basic level. Then at some point, that becomes your way of seeing the world. So your way of analyzing a set of data, for example, you end up using the reading you've done to build a model, to have certain expectations of the world. Certainly talk about that in the writing session as well. So it'll guide your perspective on the world. And then at some point, you have to decide whether or not it's guiding your intellectual, cognitive perspective on the world alone. So I don't want to say just a researcher, but you're going to be doing this for research purposes, or it's guiding your practical engagements with the world, right? And then you can return to the same book from either of those two perspectives. How is this book going to help me reflect on and possibly change my theory, my way of seeing the world, versus how is this book going to change my way of doing business, right? Of engaging practically with the world. And those are two different ways of going about it. We'll talk about this as well in the writing session, but even as a student, you should be thinking about how is this book changing my way of seeing the world? But it's not going from one state of theory to another. It's usually going from a state of sort of common sense intuition about the world to a position of where you have some theoretical sophistication on the world, right? So that you're actually letting the book make you think a little more abstractly, a little more objectively, maybe, about things you kind of thought you already had some sense of. So I'd say it's not really an exact science, the way a book changes you like that. But at the beginning, you're just struggling with getting the concepts. You're learning new words, you're learning a very new way of seeing things. And at some point that becomes kind of your background or default way of looking at the world. And then reading it again from that perspective, where you're already seeing the world this way now in terms of dynamic capabilities, if you're reading Tease, how is reading the book a little more closely again with all of those expectations and that entire perspective on board? How is it going to, how can reading the book enrich, probably change, certainly deepen? How can I find a little extra nuance in that perspective? So it's a different set of ambitions. Also, as a student, you're probably concerned with, am I learning the things I need to learn for the exam? And that perspective falls away when you become a researcher. Right? So the more you become the more you take more of a scholarly attitude, and I would encourage you to kind of pretend that, even as a student. You don't worry about passing the exam, you worry about getting this right. You worry about seeing the world correctly, right? So that's also a change that happens there. And the great thing that really happens is you start seeing authors of books as equals, intellectual peers, right? You stop seeing them as teachers and you start seeing them more as partners in conversation, colleagues. That's really a great kind of thing to reach that stage where you're kind of feel like, oh yeah, I'm part of a conversation here. I'm not just listening to somebody talk. Did that, yeah. Yeah, but keep in mind that, and I would say not just for the book, it's not just books that are like spoons, it's prose really. I mean, really it's prose writing. It's writing in sentences and paragraphs. That's the invention that we came up with maybe, I don't know, 500 years ago. Really started getting clear that the way we do this is we write in sentences and paragraphs and we divide things up nicely and we have one idea at a time. That's the big invention. And if we remember that that's what we're doing when we're reading, we're engaging with the world as prose, right? Then we will really get something out of it. Good. So that's our first little iceberg. Remember that what your reading is doing is it's giving you something under the surface to support your thinking, talking, and your writing. And remember that there's lots of different kinds of texts. Some of them are giving you just basically documentation for information, and some of them are giving you more of an actual literary experience, this invitation to participate in a conversation with other knowledgeable people. And that's really what the books and the journal articles are there for, right, is to help facilitate that. One thing you can do with periodicals like this, I also often recommend the New Yorker. is if you read The Economist and The New Yorker regularly, one of the things that I can assure you of is you're exposing yourself to just really competent prose. Right? They make a great effort to not just hire people who can write, but they have editors who insist on doing things in certain ways. So you get a really good example of people who really think about punctuation and spelling and forming an argument and writing paragraphs properly and so forth, right? So it gives you a good standard of prose writing. It's not fully academic. It is journalism, but it does give you a good standard of writing. So I would encourage you to just expose yourself to that because it is good writing. Great. Let's do another iceberg. And this is what I want to try to do with this one is to get you thinking about how to take a text apart. And what I want to do is think about sort of a fictional journal article. One of the things that's certainly a challenge at university is learning how to read journal articles, right? What's going on in a journal article. And a good reason to do that is that it also gives you a way of thinking about how to write one. So it's a good way of preparing for that. And many years ago, a really, really important literary theorist, important to us, maybe more than to the world literature, named Wayne C. Booth. He's also the author of a manual that you can find in the library and that I promote very often called The Craft of Research, which just goes through every feature of doing a good research project. In the spring, when some of you will be working on your year-end projects, there's another series of talks that I do called The Craft of Research, which is all about doing research project. And it's inspired by and based on this manual called The Craft of Research by Wayne Booth. He has a very interesting anecdote he tells. He says when he says that he's heard, it's a rumor, that in an Oxford tutorial, they only ever ask 2 questions of a text. What does the author mean? How does the author know? Right? 2 questions. What does the author mean? Right? And how does the author know? And then he says, I doubt the report, I doubt the rumors. No university could be that good. Right? So what I'm trying to tell you is you can make your university that good simply by approaching every text you read with those 2 questions in mind. And you can give yourself a world-class university experience just by saying, I'm going to insist on looking at a text and asking of it always, what does the author mean? And how does the author know? And then we can be a little bit analytical about this. We can say the author isn't always going to, the author doesn't just mean one thing with a text. So we write a journal article or we write a book chapter. We're not just saying one thing. We are trying to say maybe one overarching thing. We have an overarching conclusion or thesis, but there's lots of things being said. So the author means many different things, is making many different claims. And we can analyze those as different kinds of things that are being said on different kinds of bases, right? So one of the things they will be saying will go in the background section of a paper. And so you'll find that in most papers and most research papers that you read, there'll be some little description of the country that's being studied or of the company that's being studied or the product that is being analyzed, the recent events that have sort of occasioned this, the campaign or the management technique, right, that this paper is going to be analyzing. Right? So there'll be some sort of background information that is provided, and it is not theory, right? It's not going to be the theory that the author is using to frame the analysis. It's just information about people, the company that he studied, and so forth. So it's going to be based on what I've called documentation. So under the surface of that, we will have some amount of reading, and it will be based on newspaper articles. It will be based on company reports. It will be based on official statistics, that sort of thing, right? And what's basically happening here is we can say that some of the underlying information in a text, some of the basis that any author has for saying what they say, some answers to the question, how does he know? How does the author know, right? Will be a reference to what has the author read, right? So we have a text and the author has read something, and that's how the author knows, because the author has told us that they've read this newspaper, this report, or so forth. And of course, there's two kinds of that. There's background information, and there, whoops, wrong thing on the wrong thing. And there's theory, and I think you know where I'm going with this one. The theory is going to be based on the literature, right? So there's two kinds of reading that an author will have done that will answer the question, how does the author know? In many cases, the answer you come up with when you ask, what's the author trying to tell me? So the author is going to say, sense making is a retrospective process, right? Let's say the author claims, that's what the author, the author says sense making is a retrospective process. How does the author know? Well, the author is going to cite Carl Weick, and on page 54, sure enough, we are told that sense making is a retrospective process, right? So it's that, sometimes it's that simple, right? What does the author mean? We figure out that it's sense making is a retrospective process by reading. How does the author know? We realize, well, that's because the author has read the classic in the tradition. But that's not the only way that the authors we read know things. It's not, if like say, we'd live in a boring world if everything we read was validated by simply something else that the person who wrote it had read. So it's just all writing is just reporting on reading, right? So what we want to do is want to say there's other things going on. And the most important ones are the, well, no, I don't want to say the most important ones. Our method and analysis, one of the sources of knowledge, one of the ways that many of the authors that we read know things is on the basis of data. So when we're reading them, we'll say, all right, how does the author know that the sense making that was done by the research and development team in Novo Nordisk in 2015 was prospective and not retrospective? Well, they did interviews, right? And so they have a data set. And in those interviews, it became clear that some of the sense making was prospective and not retrospective, right? So there might be some data. But notice what I just said. How did they know the data? Well, they went out and they did the interviews. So on the basis of actual empirical investigation, on the basis of their experience gathering data, right? They gather some data. They report their method. How do they know they did semi-structured interviews? Well, because they actually did them, right? So that's they're just reporting what they did and why they did it. So they're just telling you a story about their lives, basically. Very formal, very scientific parts of their lives, but they're just telling stories, right? So when we're answering this question, how does the author know? We're going to say, well, some of it they know from reading the newspaper, some of it they know from reading the scientific literature, some of it they know from their own experience, some of it they know from the data they've collected by their own experience, right? Does that make sense? And that if we keep track of that as we're reading, we say, what are the things I'm learning here and where are they coming from? And we also start tracing, how does this conversation work, right? Who are these authors that we're talking to? Then there's one more section in most papers is the discussion section. And this one's fun. I'll actually just put experience here as well, like this. This one's fun because there's an important way that we know things that we sometimes don't like to brag about. I think we're happy bragging about how much reading we've done. And we're also happy bragging about how much data we've collected, actually, and how hard that was to do those interviews. So we'll talk about that a lot. But one of the things that we're a little bit harder just to say, this is why I think this is true, right? This is how I know, because I'm smart, right? Because I'm intelligent, because I've thought a great deal about this, right? I've used my reason, right? This is actually how I wanted to do this. I'll just do this correctly. Experience, and then we'll just point like this, just like that one. So underneath any text that we're reading, when we're trying to figure out how does the author know, there's going to be a combination of what they've read, right? What they have experienced, and what they have thought about, right? The reasoning that they have done. Right? And notice this, what's really happening is we're kind of taking some of this iceberg and turning it a little bit upside down and saying, well, this ability to think is down here underneath the text that we're reading. Right? And we're trying to identify these people as knowledgeable people performing the same competence that we perform when we think, talk, and write as part of our classes. Right? And so again, we're getting this identification with the authors that we're reading, saying, I'm a reader, but I'm a reader just like they are. They're also readers, right? They're also experiencers, so am I, right? I do interviews, I collect data, or you will at some point, some kind of data that looks kind of like it, right? And I certainly also do some thinking. I know what that's like. Right? And there's been some thinking behind a book like this, right? When I read it. Does that make sense so far? I promised it would be 3/4 of an hour. It's probably going to be an hour, but I will. But then I will stop. We'll still have time for questions. What I want to do is we got these two icebergs, and icebergs are always big and cold, and they're in stormy oceans, and it all feels very daunting. And I understand that, and so we want to take this down into a smaller format so that we can do one thing at a time. Right, that we can break this into what I talked about before, into prose. And the way I'm going to do this is to look at an ice cube. Right. So if we don't want to worry about a whole big icebergs, we can worry about little ice cubes. And the way we do that is we think about the unit of composition of most of the reading you will do. Now, I can't promise you that all the reading you will do will be well formed in this way, but certainly most of it will be. And if you come up and look at some of these books, you'll see they're all made up of paragraphs, right? So about every half page or so, there's a hard line return and a tab indent, right? And so we have these paragraphs. You see them on a page, right? They usually just look like this. Right, like that. And for every one of these paragraphs, and I definitely say this to you as writers and as students, think of yourself as somebody that if you know something, then you have the ability to compose a coherent prose paragraph about it. Right? That's why you want to know stuff, is so that you can compose these paragraphs. And that's certainly what your writers have done. Right? The authors that you read, they've become knowledgeable and they've shaped their knowledge into paragraph-sized ideas that they're presenting one at a time. And then we can ask ourselves, well, what really ideally is a paragraph? So when we look at a paragraph, we can ask, what does the author mean in this paragraph? And how does the author know what this paragraph says? So we're giving ourselves a nice little analytical task. And the way we go about that is we say, well, a paragraph actually has a formal structure. So most paragraphs, and again, this is a rule of thumb, which means you're allowed to break them, not the thumbs, but the rules, right? But they're nice to have, and they're nice just to stick to. And you'll notice most of the writing you read will be somewhere in this ballpark. They're at least 6 sentences and at most 200 words. At least 6 sentences and at most 200 words, about half a page, right? And this is something that's interesting and maybe something you want to set as a goal for yourself when you're developing your reading abilities, right? Is they take about a minute to read. 200 words is about 1 minute of your attention. So in about 1 minute, you should get it, right? A good paragraph is one that you can read effectively for the information it's trying to provide in about 1 minute. And it always says one thing. So a paragraph will say one thing using about 1 minute of your time in at least 6 sentences and at most 200 words, right? And will do one of 3 things. Again, it may do a combination of these things. So maybe two or three of these 3 things. It may do a 4th thing sometimes, but usually if you look at a paragraph, you say, let me see if it does one of these things, right? It may support, elaborate, or defend the one thing that it's saying. Right, so a paragraph is saying one thing. You'll usually be able to find the so-called key sentence in the paragraph. So it'll be one of the sentences will actually quite directly say, sense making is a retrospective process, or the internet has changed the way businesses communicate with their customers, or books will never be obsolete, just like spoons, right? Something, a nice, simple declarative sentence that you can understand. That's what the author is trying to say, right? Well, how does the author know that? Well, the author's either done some reading, has had some experiences, or has thought about it a great deal, right? And that doesn't map directly onto support, elaborate, or defend, but what that does is it gives us a sense of, okay, what is the author trying to do with this paragraph? And the best way to go about that is to say, take that key sentence and ask yourself, what is it about that sentence that required a whole paragraph? Why couldn't the author just say the one sentence to me, right? Why did I need an entire paragraph before I really got this? That must be because it was difficult in some way. There was something hard about it, right? And there's really 3 things that can be hard about a key sentence in a paragraph. So there's 3 things that can be difficult about the idea that a half page of your reading presents to you. So when you think, oh, this is hard, like you're reading something, you think this is hard, you should think, well, what is it about it that is hard, right? Is it hard to believe? Is it hard to understand? Or is it hard to agree with, which is, I think, the one that's most fun. And you can kind of tell what the writer thought by really paying attention to how the paragraph is written. Sometimes the paragraph will be written like, I'm going to tell you something, and here are good reasons to believe that I'm right about it, right? So here's the financial data that I've either taken from Bloomberg or the annual reports that support my claim that the company's had a good 3rd quarter, right? So I guess I thought you would have a hard time believing that, right? I guess you wanted help believing this was true. It doesn't mean you were necessarily very skeptical. It just means it's the kind of thing you're willing to believe. You just want the evidence, right? You're just not just going to believe it. You just want a good source for it before you'll believe it, right? Because you're an ordinary skeptical reader. You're not resistant, right? You're just critical. But there are lots of paragraphs where the writer doesn't seem to be trying to get you to believe it. The writer's trying to get you to understand exactly what they mean by it, right? So they're explaining what their words mean. They're explaining how they're operationalizing these concepts. They're explaining the significance of it, right? Or they're even just telling a story. They're not giving you any evidence that it's true, right? So they're just telling you the story. They're trying to get you to understand what happened, right? Maybe later on, they'll give you a source that helps you to believe it's true. But in this paragraph, they're clearly just telling you the story, right? They're just trying to get you to understand. So keep that in mind, that you can feel yourself, both whether you think it's hard to believe and whether you think it's hard to understand, but you can also kind of feel what the writer thought the difficulty was, right? You can kind of sense, well, this is written as though I'm having a hard time believing it or understanding, right? And then this one's the one that I think is the most fun. You read something and you realize the author thinks that I have a different opinion. And so the author's treating me, the reader, like somebody who would disagree with them. And they're acknowledging my objections. They're saying, you, dear reader, might think this and that, right? But I still think my idea is a good one, right? So you're feeling that kind of rhetorical tension. So you're being approached as a problem, but not as a problem of believing or understanding, but as a problem of agreeing. Okay? And again, you can say, look, this paragraph is obviously written as though I disagree with them, but the author couldn't know this, but I actually agree with them. So it's a waste of their energy on me, right? But apparently there's some reader that this author imagined needed to defend themselves against, right? You always have to remember that the reader that the text kind of produces it as you're reading it isn't necessarily you. You might have no problem believing it. You might have no problem understanding it, but the text is being written as though, right? Implicitly, that's what you're doing. Does that make sense? So try to, yeah. Support, elaborate, or defend. And it, basically just means any kind of elaboration or unpacking of the idea, right? The third one, I can understand that you can't, that is completely illegible. I'm sorry about that. Defend. When we talk, we'll talk about this again in the how to write session. When you'll probably notice this, sometimes authors get a little bit aggressive in their defense, and it really becomes an attack on people who think this way. But ideally, you're only using that minute of the reader's attention to defend yourself. You're not going after the reader, right? Because you only have a minute of their time. So you should respect that. Right? So when I talk to you as writers, I say, try to remain merely defensive. Don't be all attacking, right? But you will find writers that are quite aggressive in their writing. Yeah. This is why the rule of thumb. Ideally, the author went to the paragraph with purity of heart and only was trying to do one thing for that 1 minute with one idea, right? But often you'll find writers aren't that disciplined, and you'll find yourself trying to do various things as well. But even if that's what happens, is that you're reading it and you say, look, I think mainly it's trying to elaborate the idea for me, but it seems to be sneaking in. It seems to be a little bit worried about belief, or it seems to be getting a little bit defensive as well. That's fine to have that as part of your reading outcome. Like your analysis of the paragraph can be, it's doing a little bit of both. That's fine. That will happen. But it's just a good kind of reading strategy to say, what is it mainly trying to do?
Also start with elaborating on the topic. Will it be structured one first day?
That's not going to be the case with every paragraph. Some paragraphs will really literally only spend the entire paragraph trying to get you to understand, and will make no effort to get you to believe. And some of them will only be defending themselves and not trying to do any of the other things. So no, don't think of it as the problem. Maybe that's a really good question, actually. Using this as a reading heuristic, don't think of it as I'm looking for evidence of the 3 things that it should be doing. Like I'm trying to find, like the right answer would always have 3 things. Because I think that's going to be a little bit of a waste of time. What you want to do is say, what's it mainly trying to do? And then you might notice that it's also doing a little bit of a side errand, right? It's also it's going on a little bit of a detour every once in a while, and it's not quite sticking to the program, right? And that's fine, right? But try to see what mainly is it trying to do. There's a 4th option that you'll sometimes run into. You'll realize that the writer has decided the reader has no problem believing, understanding, or agreeing. So the writer is assuming I'm bored with a subject and is trying to get me excited about it. So there's a kind of an attempt to motivate, sort of a motivational component in some paragraphs. So I'm sort of trying to show you why this is important, right? Even though you understand, believe, and agree with it. So keep that one in mind as well as a possibility. And there may be others. There may be, for some paragraphs, there may be others, but this is a nice thing to just look for this first. What's it trying to say? And is it trying to get me to believe it, to understand it, or agree with me? about it? You've got some really nice heuristics, right? Always ask yourself for every paragraph, what does the author mean? Try to get a sense of how does the author know? Is it based on reading experience or reason, right? And then maybe go through this, right? Is the writer trying to get me to believe, understand, or agree with me? Agree with them. Good. And then there's one last thing I want to show you as a kind of, because one of the things that when you're reading, students always ask us, like, what about taking notes? What's a good way of taking notes? And I got to say, you've probably already developed a way of taking notes and keeping track of them and so forth. So I'm not saying that's wrong if you've got a way that works. I'm just saying, here's, if you want like to try something else or something like that. It's a 3-column system. So what you would do is you would say, what does the author mean? And so for every paragraph you're reading now, right? So every half page or so, you're going to make a note of what the key sentence is. And that's going to be usually a simple declarative sentence. So it may be 12 words or something like that. So you'll look in the paragraph and you'll say, what in this paragraph, what is the one sentence that says the one thing the paragraph says? Right? Then you're going to make a note of whether or not it supports, elaborates, or defends. Right? So you can just kind of say S if it's supporting, and then make a list of not all this, like don't just quote the whole paragraph, right? But just make a list of what are the facts that are being adduced in support, defense, or elaboration. Right? Does that make sense? So your notes are now going to have a key sentence, which is actually a quote. And keep that in mind, actually, when you're taking notes, that your key sentence, if you do use it in your writing, you're going to have to put quotation marks around it because you did pick it out of the paragraph, right? Usually. Sometimes maybe you will just make it a paraphrase, but try to, if you are quoting, make sure you tell yourself this is a quote, because otherwise you'll get in trouble later when you use it in your own writing. And then make a list of the facts, right, that are supporting, elaborating, or defending, right? And then what you do is you say, and how does the author know that, right? Because remember, this isn't really how does the author know. This is still what does the author mean? Because the author is saying, this is true because this, right? You should believe this because of these facts, right? Or let's say you've got another one, and now it's going to be elaborate. So now it's you should understand this in this way. So now we've got things we should understand by this, right? But that's still just what the author means. Still just what the author is trying to get you to believe or understand, right? And then we ask ourselves, how does the author know? Like, why does the author write about that? And that is as simple as writing Vike, 1995, page 54, right? Or the author is telling me a story from the data that they collected. So they've done field work and they're telling me a story about what happened in the business, right? Does that make sense? So now you have a set of notes for a piece of writing you have, which summarizes the text in one sentence for every half page. So about 2 sentences per page. And these are sentences usually written by the author that you're summarizing because they are quoted out of the context of that. You've got another column with a list of the information that supports, elaborates, or defends those key sentences. And you have a list of the sources that have been used to support that paragraph for paragraph. This column will eventually, of course, probably anyway, list all the sources in the literature list of the text that you're reading, right, at the end, because there'll be a bibliography at the end. Right? Does that make sense? So like I say, we try to keep these things sort of informal. I've already gone over time, but I hope that that was useful to you. The whole idea here is to have whatever here made sense to you that you can use and just put them together in some kind of strategy for approaching a text. One of the things I haven't said, but that I will say again and again in some of the other sessions is when you're reading, Just like in everything else you do at university, please don't do it to the point of exhaustion. Right? Give yourself a certain amount of minutes or hours to read, preferably breaking them up into chunks of 20 or 30 minutes, where you give yourself a certain amount of pages to read in that time, and then try to move through your reading plan according to a schedule, not according to, am I understanding everything perfectly here, right? Not according to, am I done, right? Not according to, am I satisfied, but just do the work, move through it, and then repeat tomorrow. And only do it for as many hours as you can do without getting exhausted. One of the things you don't want to do is have this sense that I only know I've worked hard enough if I'm so exhausted that I can't do anything more today. But you want to say, I'm going to study for some hours today, and then I'm going to stop, and I'm going to relax, and then I'll do it again tomorrow. Right? Because that, as a sustainable strategy for going to school, is way better than the kind of the moral certainty of I've exhausted myself to the point where I hate my subject. I no longer want to read a text about dynamic capabilities ever again, right? And I'm going to get a great grade, but then I'll never want to think about this again. So keep maintaining that enjoyment of the reading, keep engaging with it as curious, intelligent people. And then I think you'll get more out of it. I realize that sounds moralizing, so I can only kind of suggest that as a strategy, right? Plan it and then try to stick to that plan. Good. I'm going to turn off the recording now. Thank you for listening and thank you for following online. There's nobody online. But it will be, hopefully, if I've done this right, the recording will be really nice. And then I will upload it and so forth.